This lecture shall examine federal judiciary building between 1805 to 1877. It is important to remember that during the first part of the 19th century, vast territorial expansion occurred. Remember, there were only 13 colonies prior to the Revolutionary War, but in 1803 there would be the Louisiana Purchase, followed by the addition of multiple other states. This territorial expansion increased tensions between the North and the South, both of which fought over control of the West. Northerners advocated for financial policies designed to promote a bustling commercial economy, whereas Southerners dreamt of an agricultural nation that included the institution of slavery. Interestingly, during the territorial expansion of the 19th century, Supreme Court justices still had to ride circuit, and their workload was increasing given the fact that America was beginning to grow at such a fast pace. Most of the newly admitted Western states, such as Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, were not immediately assigned to a circuit. This was due in part to the fact that circuit riding would have required U.S. Supreme Court justices to travel across the Appalachian Mountains, which would have been very time-consuming and inconvenient, to say the least. So in some respects, newly admitted states to the Union were given a second-class status. However, the Judiciary Act of 1807 would change this, as this act established the Seventh Circuit and comprised the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. This was an act of judiciary building which was done by the legislature. It was an uncontroversial act that was mainly designed to appease the newly admitted Western states. The act was supported by both Democrat Republicans and Federalists. The Judiciary Act of 1807 also added a seventh justice to the U.S. Supreme Court. The sitting president, Thomas Jefferson, who was also a member of the Democratic-Republican Party, would get to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court. The act specified that this newest Supreme Court appointment must have resided within the newly created Seventh Circuit. This would create an informal norm that would last for more than 5 decades. Any time a new justice would be appointed, he typically would have to come from the circuit where he had resided. So, for example, if a justice from the Second Circuit retired, then the president would find a replacement justice who was also from the Second Circuit. This is significant because justices who come from different circuits were likely to have different thoughts about what they believed to be the appropriate role of the judiciary in American democracy. Even though a Seventh Circuit had been created for the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, there were still several newly admitted states which were not included within the circuit system for much of the second half of the 19th century. So after it passed the Judiciary Act of 1807, the legislature did not do much to expand the judiciary. To his credit, though, Chief Justice John Marshall managed to expand the power of the federal judiciary through cleverly crafted U.S. Supreme Court opinions from behind the bench. But John Marshall did not have the power to integrate the newly admitted Western states into the circuit system. This would be something that would have to come from the legislature, and the legislature would take its time in implementing this. From 1829 to 1837, Andrew Jackson, a Southern Democrat, would serve as the 7th President of the United States. Jacksonian Democrats renewed and updated the Jeffersonian tradition, shifting the country away from nationalism and bringing it back toward the small government, with an emphasis on agriculture. Jacksonian Democrats opposed the Bank of the United States and supported states' rights over a strong, centralized government. Though Democrats during this time period appealed to the common man, they favored policies which were detrimental to racial minorities. For example, Jackson, who was himself a wealthy slave owner, was against the abolition movement. Also, he was in favor of the removal of American Indians. Andrew Jackson was a shrewd politician, and it was not long before he began asking Congress to extend the federal judiciary throughout the newly admitted Western states. Jackson was a Westerner himself, and he quickly realized that if the Supreme Court grew during his tenure as president, he could try to take advantage of this and pack the court with like-minded Democrats. After all, additional Democratic appointees on the court would mean more pro-Jacksonian and fewer anti-Jacksonian judicial decisions. During the course of his presidency, Jackson would appoint 6 justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. Jackson consistently replaced Federalist and National Republican justices with Democratic ones. And when Chief Justice John Marshall died, Andrew Jackson would appoint Roger Taney as the court's new Chief Justice in 1836. Chief Justice Taney is most remembered for delivering the majority opinion in Dred Scott versus Sandford that ruled, among other things, that African Americans, having been considered inferior at the time the Constitution was drafted, were not part of the original community of citizens and could not be considered citizens of the United States. Taney is probably the worst U.S. Supreme Court justice ever. This decision in Dred Scott versus Sandford was one of the factors that led the country to a civil war, a war which would last more than 4 years and be responsible for the carnage of well more than 500,000 American citizens. In 1837, the House and Senate passed the Judiciary Act of 1837. This act would add 2 new circuits to the federal judicial system, as well as 2 new justices to the Supreme Court, bringing the total number of circuits and justices to 9. All 26 states in the United States were now included in the circuit system as a result of the Judiciary Act of 1837. It was without question the most important piece of legislation to expand the federal judiciary within the last 30 years. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court would safeguard slavery, which would anger abolitionists and push the nation closer to the brink of civil war. The Judiciary Act of 1837 not only extended the circuit system to the West, it more importantly resulted in a Supreme Court that favored Democrats and slave owners. In 1837, 5 of the 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court were allotted to states which permitted slavery. Jackson made sure that his appointees to the Supreme Court were sympathetic to slave owners. He fundamentally changed the court. Jackson appointed 6 U.S. Supreme Court justices, the 3rd most of any president in American history. By the time California was admitted to the Union in 1850, all 9 of the court's justices had been appointed by Democratic presidents. After the Dred versus Scott case, the Republican Party sought to break the Southern stranglehold on the Supreme Court. The Republicans desired to remake rather than demolish the federal judiciary. Soon after Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860, Southern states began to secede from the Union. By the time Lincoln assumed office in 1861, 7 states had already seceded. Republican legislators in the House and Senate took full advantage of this. Since a majority of Southern legislators were not in attendance at the 37th Congress, Republicans were able to make structural and organizational reforms to the federal judiciary under the Judiciary Acts of 1862 and 1863. The absence of Southerners from Congress resulted in virtually uncontested pro-Northern institution building. Republican legislators proposed and passed without debate a bill which created a 10th Circuit, authorizing the appointment of a 10th U.S. Supreme Court Justice. This was a deliberate attempt, I should say, by Republicans to reconfigure the judicial branch into an institution that would be more favorable to Republican views on slavery, that being getting rid of slavery. It is important to point out that the years preceding, encompassing, and following the Civil War were some of the most formative in the development of federal judicial power. The events of the Civil War and Reconstruction empowered rather than dismantled the federal courts. In fact, by 1877, 2 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, the federal judiciary was more powerful than ever before. Civil War and Reconstruction-era federal judiciary building was done by Republican politicians in both the House and the Senate and served as a check on the power of Southern states. Efforts were made to empower the federal judiciary at the expense of state courts, particularly Southern state courts. Federal courts after the Civil War were given substantially more jurisdiction and were meant to protect Unionists and recently freed slaves from harassment, discrimination, and maltreatment in the South. Republicans used the federal judiciary to get cases out of biased state judicial systems and into the impartial federal judiciary. During Reconstruction, Republicans sought to systematically disempower state courts, especially Southern state courts, and empower the federal judiciary. Multiple pieces of legislation were passed which would expand the power of the federal judiciary. Federal courts would begin to oversee the behavior of state court judges. Republican legislators were quite crafty in empowering the federal judiciary. For example, the Judiciary Act of 1866 was passed to reduce the size of the Supreme Court from 10 to 7 justices. This was done in order to prevent President Andrew Johnson, a lifetime Democrat, it was to prevent him to have an opportunity to pack the court. However, once Ulysses S. Grant succeeded Johnson as president, then the legislature passed the Circuit Judges Act of 1869, which increased the size of the court to 9 justices. President Grant would be able to appoint 5 justices to the Supreme Court, although one of his appointees would pass away before making it to the court. Both the Judiciary Act of 1866 and the Circuit Judges Act of 1869 would give Republicans a considerable political advantage and would perpetuate Northern dominance over Southern states. Supreme Court justices also no longer had to ride circuit, which meant that they could devote more attention specifically to the Supreme Court. By 1877, the federal judiciary would have a larger role and more extensive power than ever before.